not surprisingly, we're behind. Already, after 1 week, we're behind. Because we were supposed to do 2 chapters last week, Jason.
We didn't stop. We didn't take a break.
I know, but none of you seem to like get bored. And so I thought this is stuff you don't know, so I had to keep telling you. Like this is. If you had gone like, yeah, we know this, then I would have said, let's skip 10 slides.
We made the 130 slides.
Yeah, there's 130 slides today too, but we're gonna go a lot faster.
We had to.
Not that face.
No, we know that.
All right. I think it's important because I really still don't think that you know the structure and function of the nervous system. So we're going to spend, right, I believe this, right? So if I'm wrong, you can prove me wrong in like 15 weeks. But we're going to go fast. And I'm going to tell you things you need to know, and there are things in here that you probably don't need to know, but you can always go back because they're here, right? Like I don't think you need to know about stem cells. They're exciting, but whatever. You've got different kinds of neurons. You guys remember? Does this seem like something you guys remember? Great. Hey, these are awesome. You want to hear about something cool? This is relevant to you. It's hot in here. Hey. No, what about the button with the lights?
This one?
Try it.
Maybe the lights are.
That's.
Yeah, that'll help on. No, just off.
Those are worse. Those can lights are like a tanning bed. And we're all going to come out of here looking like George Hamilton. That was a joke somebody got. And that's going to be bad. So we're just going to go like this. So this is important. There are all kinds of different cells, right? And they'll spend this time like telling you like, how many of you remember like unipolar and multipolar, bipolar? It's a total waste of your time. Who cares how many poles they have? Because it doesn't really make a difference. What makes a difference is it where it needs to be, and does it do the job that it's supposed to do, right? It's still a neuron. It's got different things, right? Do you need a screwdriver? Awesome. It's important, right? If it's like a Phillips or a flathead, or if you've got like some kind of torque bit or whatever, right? Those are important things to know. It's still a screwdriver, right? So it's still going to do whatever it does. It's not an important way to sort of organize things. But what I do think is interesting is they just found a new type of neuron. Did you guys read about this? I haven't read the paper yet in Nature Neuroscience, but I'm excited. Very rarely do you find like a whole new type of cell in the human body, right? We've been a couple centuries now looking at human brains, right? So this is like really fascinating. And these are the guys at the Allen Brain Institute. You guys familiar with the Allen Brain Institute? So there's this guy named Allen. No, it's Paul Allen. You guys know Paul Allen, right?
No.
Kyle, what do these people know? You guys know Bill Gates?
Yeah.
Yeah. Paul Allen is his like less famous partner. Yeah, so he's like a co-founder of Microsoft, right? So Paul Allen. So once he got out of like, you know, running Microsoft and like, hey, Windows 3.1, it's like, well, I think I've reached my pinnacle in the software world. He started. You guys don't even remember Windows 3.1, do you? That's okay. Like Windows 98. That's a better joke. So then he started the Allen Brain Institute. They're working on like slicing up human brains, right? So they can like get all these cells. But they just found something, they call it the rose hip cell, right? So they call it
that on the radio, on NPR. It was exciting.
It is exciting. But you totally forgot about it until I had spent 5 minutes telling you about it, right?
That's right.
But great job anyway. Like, thanks for joining in. But really, it's completely awesome, right? Because they don't have this cell in like any other species. We've not seen it anywhere else. And this is a possible reason. And so again, why is this important to you? One of the things you want to think about is like clinical trials, right? And so when you think about clinical trials for drugs, we'll do this in rodents all the time, right? Because rodents are cheap, they're easy to breed. People don't, I mean, some people get worked up, but they're not going to get as worked up if you're like pumping drugs into a mouse as if you are into a person, right? So they're those standards, right? So this rose hip cell, it's like not in any other species as far as we know, but it is in humans. Could be a reason like there are all of these like failed clinical trials, right? Like you can do something in a mouse and you're like, wow, that psychotropic med really works, and then you like give it to a person and it's like, well, that was a waste of time. And so these things do happen. There are sort of companies that fail constantly because they because they don't have the right clinical trial results, right? And so that happens. Don't worry about too much of the rest. You guys know there's a soma, the dendrites, and the axon. Most of the drugs that you're going to be thinking about are going to affect things that happen at the synapse, right? Now this could have some effect at the soma because that's where you have like your nucleus with your DNA, right? It's going to get turned into RNA and proteins. So that could affect, like if we think about like gene transcription, right, or upregulation or downregulation of certain DNA things. So that could be an issue, something you want to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Mostly we're going to be thinking about things that happen out at the dendrites, right? We're going to, because that's where most of your synaptic contacts are. So Jason, we're going to think about how is this affecting ion channels? How is this mimicking other neurotransmitters, things like that. There you go. There's some kind of neuron. Cytoplasm. You guys know about mitochondria, right? So there's the synapse. Powerhouse of the cell. You're obligated to say that, right? For the rest of your life. Convergence and divergence. This isn't so important unless you're thinking about circuits, and this happens sometimes. So we might want to collect a lot of information from multiple sources, converge that onto one small set of cells to make a decision about something, right, Sierra? Or we could take that little bit of information, we could spread that out into multiple places, right? And so then we have, we're kind of sending that signal more than one place. Dendritic spines are pretty awesome. Check those out. That's like super cool, right? You know why they're so cool? One of the things that you're constantly trying to do is increase surface area without increasing volume, right? Okay, and you can do that with these dendritic spines. That's pretty cool. So you're going to increase the surface area for your synaptic contacts without drastically increasing how big your head has to be, which is not necessarily that great for you because you think I'll just buy a bigger hat. It was really awesome for your mom that your head wasn't any bigger. If you don't believe me, when you leave class, call your mom up and say, hey, how much bigger would you like for my head to have been when I was born? And she will say 2 sizes smaller. I promise. And, right? You just now figured it out. You guys know, this is kind of important. Prolonged synaptic activity, right? So you guys understand like how you can change your synapses. Somebody go ahead and yell it out. Like neurons that fire together, wire together, right? That's totally meaningless unless you really understand how that works, right? And that works through this sort of like synaptic strengthening. Again, you don't really understand what that means, right, at some level. But then, Jason, we get to the point where like, man, we're just activating all this stuff and we're increasing like the AMPA receptors by affecting the PK and zeta. You're lost. That's okay. Just understand this is how we go through this process, right? And some folks have problems with that. How many of you, don't answer this, how many of you have ever used ketamine? See, that's why I said, like, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. You don't have to answer them, truthfully. I mean, at some point you have to answer questions I ask you if you want to pass this class, but not right now. So ketamine is something, right? And this is something you guys are going to deal with people who use ketamine. Yeah, exactly, right? So that's the reason they call it that is ketamine actually interferes with your NMDA receptors, right? So these are glutamate receptors. They're very important if you want to remember what happened to you, right? So this is why ketamine is used as a date rape drug, because you're not going to remember what happened to you. And you're still going to be up walking around, right? So it's like a dissociative anesthetic. It's not a like you're on the ground and somebody's got to drag you back to their house anesthetic, right? It's the like, I'll give you a little bit and you'll walk to my car anesthetic, right? Isn't that weird, Jason? It is. Some people will use ketamine recreationally, right? Okay, so that happens. Why not? I mean, It's actually, when you think about it in that kind of use, it's actually sort of in the same category like the psychedelics, right? So it has some similar effects, you know, as LSD. That's fun. We'll talk. Because, so we're getting there, right? So NMDA receptors are necessary for that, those changes in your synapse structure, right? Because that's part of this long-term potentiation process, right? So for learning and memory. And I was trying to think of like how can we relate that pharmacologically to something you might see. Now they're actually using, ketamine's a great antidepressant. You remember that thing that made you feel... True story. You know, like
because you can't remember how sad you are.
I think so. They give you this drug and you're like, I can't remember why I was feeling so bad. I must be okay. But they do. Like this is not just like man, I'm just going to go buy some Special K and give it a try and see if I feel better. There are clinicians who will prescribe ketamine for intractable depression. Like that is a real like clinical setting situation. That's not, and they will tell you like ketamine is really one of the best, most effective antidepressants you can take. I wouldn't recommend it long term, right? It's one of those things like, I feel so bad, I'm just going to take a shot of ketamine. And then hopefully that's the last time you have to do that. Because you won't remember. It also has some great applications for horses. Right? If you want to, they use it as a veterinary anesthetic, primarily. Largely because you don't, it doesn't have any sort of effects on your breathing, right? So you don't have to intubate or anything like that. You can just like, you know, hit them with the ketamine. It also has like some battlefield sort of applications as well, right? So if somebody's just been blasted, right? One, like not anesthetizing them so they can't walk out is not good. So if you can give them like some ketamine and they can still walk, like maybe for like an evac sort of situation, and then it actually cuts down the likelihood of PTSD. Again, because it's interfering with their memory process, right? So they're not going to have that problem. Hey, here's a shocker. Folks with mental impairments have fewer or smaller dendritic spines. It doesn't really tell you anything. Axon hillock, you don't really need to know that. We're going to talk a lot about neurotransmitters later. Myelin, you guys know about the myelin sheath, right? And how that sort of increases conduction velocity. That's important. You may see folks who don't have, or they have a disease, right, where they have like multiple sclerosis, right, where they're going to lose their myelin sheath, right? Okay, and that can cause a lot of problems. It kind of depends on. Here's what's important about brain damage is it's the same three rules apply to brain damage as it does to real estate, and that's location, 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 right? If somebody says, oh man, I have a brain tumor, you're like, well, what's that mean? And then somebody says, oh, I have a brain tumor and it's here, then you know what they're talking about, right? Because that's how you know what's actually the problem. Same thing with any sort of degenerative disorder. If it's localized degeneration, right? If you've had a stroke, you've had some damage. If you've got MS, it's affecting your motor system. Maybe it's affecting, you know, other brain circuits. You're going to have different problems. This is pronounced nodes of Ranvier. Please pronounce it nodes of Ranvier. Right? Okay, some people don't. And you don't want to be one of those people. Anybody call it Ranvier? Thank you for being honest.
I've never heard that.
Ranvier?
No, what you said.
Ranvier? Yeah, the guy was French-Canadian. Ranvier, not node. No, Ranvier was French-Canadian. How do I know this? I learned about ion channels from a Canadian. Chromosomes, whatever, DNA, transcription factors. This is something, right? Drug use, stress, all of these things can affect transcription factors, right? So they can drive up or down certain protein synthesis. I'll talk about that as you need to. Hey, there's a fun picture. Hey, who's heard of the central dogma? Nobody's heard of the central dogma, right? When was the last time you had a biology class? Maybe that's what I thought. Like an actual biology class. No, because you didn't get any more of that, and you're going to get out of this class. Because you weren't any better prepared. You just like...
Oh, like actual biology? Yeah.
2012.
Yeah. Freshman year. 2012.
So, I'm going to make a new homework assignment. It's going to be easy. But it's going to require you to read, so you're probably not going to do it. But I'm going to test you on it, so I'll know. No, seriously, write this down. This is important. How many of you have heard of Donald O. Hebb? Yeah, okay, so like one of you has. I know this, right? There was this guy, Donald O. Hebb. You want to talk about a brilliant Canadian neuroscientist? It was this guy. Back in like the 40s and 50s, he said, hey, man, here's how brains work. And since then, we've been figuring out, yeah, that's exactly how they work, right? So like everything that he predicted back in the 40s is basically true, right? Give or take a little variation on what we know. Hebb was actually the president of the APA. How many of you have heard of the APA? That's the APA you know about. That's the American Psychological Association, right? He was president of the APA for a while. And I think it was like in like 49 or 54, one of those years or some other year around there, he gave a speech, a presidential speech at the APA conference. Do you know what the title of that speech was? Psychology as a Biological Discipline. I want you to find that and read it. Seriously, find it and read it. I will ask you questions about it on the exam. That's a new one for you. Give everybody time to write that down.
Psychology as a discipline.
As a biological discipline.
Yeah, I got the
If you just type in like Hebb, APA, presidential speech, it will come up on the Google.
You're saying Hebb?
Hebb, H-E-B-B, Donald Olding Hebb.
Oh, the O was a middle initial. Oh, that's...
Yeah, the O is a middle initial. Oh, you thought he was Oheb. Oheb. Ah, that's O period, not O apostrophe. That's a that is a difference. That is a difference. Google will know what you mean. Look up Hebb, read that. I think it's important. Oh man, epigenetics. I wish we could talk about that, but we're not going to. I do. What?
You just triggered
Epigenetics? Why is
Yeah.
it's so fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
You got to watch though, right? Because like idiot things that you're doing now are going to affect like things you're going to try to do later when you try to pretend to be an adult, and you just don't even know it, right? I think about this all the time. Like there are these studies where this is true, where they will like have a rat and they will give her like a high-fat diet, right? And then she'll have pups, and then they'll take like half those pups and have them reared by a mother who did not have a high-fat diet. And then like even their pups will be more likely to be obese, right? It's just, because I think about that because I think about, as most of you do, I imagine you think about West Virginia from time to time. And I start to think about like some of the problems in West Virginia, right? And I start to think about we're trying to solve. So this is important for you because you're trying to solve the problems of West Virginia right now, right? That's the wrong solution. The right solution is to solve the problems in West Virginia today, 2 generations ago, right? And I know that's impossible. So what you have to do is you have to try to predict the next set of problems they're going to have and fix those, and give up on the ones we have now. Because you're not gonna solve that. The point is you got to think ahead, right? So now we got to think backwards to think ahead, okay? And so when you have these folks who come into your whatever little room that you put people in and talk to them, and they have problems, and you're gonna try to solve their problems, you're just looking at just them. That doesn't tell you anything, right? Because you have to think back so far, right? Even on a biological level. And what's really fascinating about this, and I don't know if you guys will think this is fascinating as I am, there was a study published. There's a group, I think they're in France. They were looking at the way your brain structures change if you are fed like a high-fat, high-sugary diet. The interesting thing is when they had these rats, they were like feeding this diet so they would like develop obesity, right? When they gave them amphetamine, because you know that's what you do with rats, you give them drugs. So they would give them all kinds of, amphetamine derivatives, right? Their brains responded the same as rats that they had made addicted to amphetamines, right? So the brain, isn't that just amazing, right? Like, so you start to think about connections between, like, generational connections, right? Between, like, dietary issues and then drug problems. And I was like, I had this, like, epiphany, and I started thinking about, like, what are, like, two of the biggest problems facing West Virginia? Yeah, right? Start to think about that. See, so you're trying to solve a problem now that really started 2 generations ago. You can't do anything about it. So Jason, you want to drop out of the program? I don't know. I thought that was fascinating. That's my epigenetics story for the day. This is all more than what you need. But that's a fun picture. Hey, twins, right? You guys know there are different kinds of twins. Anybody have a twin? Anybody know twins? You know a twin or you have a twin?
My husband's a twin. My siblings are triplets.
Wow.
Fertilization will do that for you.
Oh. So, yeah. So there's that. I don't know. I think I'd have stopped after after you got, like, I just wanted to, like, gamble again, right, on, like, getting more than one.
Yeah, there's 6 of them.
I was like,
The one in the middle just makes me feel sad, though. They don't have a partner.
but that's great.
Yeah, you read them, probably not.
So there you go. Monozygotic or dizygotic? You don't know.
Identical.
They're not identical. That's dizygotic.
I figured.
Yeah, monozygotic, there's like one zygote, which is my favorite insult, to call people a zygote. It really is. Because it sounds bad, and it is. You're just like a ball of 8 cells. That's what I think about you and your development. You may see this sometimes where you see folks who are twins. You got to think about if they're monozygotic or dizygotic. There are things that are different, so you don't always have like 100% concordance rates, right? So dizygotic twins, it's less. Monozygotic twins is still not perfect, right? Like schizophrenia, for example. Identical twins, if one develops schizophrenia, the other one's much more likely than your average person to develop it, but they still may not develop it, right? Because there are a lot of environmental factors and experience and other things. We've got to move stuff. Some drugs will disrupt the movement of stuff in your neurons, right? So we'll think about that when we need to. Receptors. This is important. This is something you do need to understand. Is receptors and how receptors work, right? Because every drug you take, for the most part, I mean, if it's a direct agonist or antagonist, it's going to basically mimic something that should be in your body, right? And it's going to act like that, right? So you'll have receptors. These guys have, most of the time we're going to think about receptors that are attached to ion channels, right? So we're going to take a drug, whether that's a prescribed drug or an illicit drug. You're going to take a drug, and it's going to mimic a neurotransmitter typically and attach itself to a receptor, and it's going to operate that receptor, right? Or it's going to do something else, sort of like that. Not a big deal. You guys know about sodium and potassium and chloride, right? I hope you guys learned that sometime in your life. There are ligand-gated channels, voltage-gated channels. We're not going to think much about voltage-gated channels because we're not going to be like giving people little like packets of voltage to operate these channels, but you will give them little packets of ligands, right? From time to time. Those are called pills. Yeah. You had this weird look on your face. Like, what is a packet of ligands? It's a pill, right? It's a...
Like worms or something.
Could be. Here's an ion channel. This is a ligand. What's your favorite ligand? The correct answer is dopamine. Nobody knows why, but it should be, right? None of you know why. I mean, but dopamine is always reinforcing, right? And so whatever you're doing to get dopamine, you're going to do it again. So that's got to be your favorite, right? Yeah. So let's imagine that's dopamine. It's going to go in a dopamine channel. It's going to open up, and stuff's going to come through. What stuff's coming through? Ions. That's like phosphate stuff. You don't need to know about that. Glial cells, we talked about this. Not really too important for you. Astrocytes, these are sort of important. Did we talk about blood-brain barrier stuff? Yeah. So astrocytes are the guys that help suck out nutrients through that blood-brain barrier so that you can try to keep your brain from getting toxified. We could spend a lot of time talking about action potentials, but we're not. I think you need to know how action potentials work, right? Because drugs are going to either increase or decrease the likelihood of action potentials in particular systems, right? Depending on what it is. Hey, look at this. We're already 64 slides in. I would, if you don't, like if you don't remember any of this stuff, Kyle, and I know it's not going to be you, but let's say one of your colleagues here doesn't remember, I would recommend going back and taking a look at these slides, right? But there are some key things we want to think about. Action potentials are very short. We're just talking about a couple milliseconds, right? Again, there are things you can do. There are drugs you can take. Who's heard of Novocaine? Right? Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty standard drug. Right, this guy's really interesting because it blocks those sodium channels. So that's kind of cool, right? You got to watch where you put Novocaine, though, right? Right? Because if it's blocking sodium channels, you can really shut down action potentials in places where you shouldn't. So never, like, squirt Novocaine in your brainstem, because that's responsible for, like, your heartbeat and breathing, so that's probably a bad idea. Putting some Novocaine, like, you know, in your mouth if you're getting ready to have a root canal, that's probably not a bad idea, right? Because you could probably shut down those sodium channels on those, like, pain receptor, you know, those pain neurons. So that's not so bad. Anti-epileptic drugs. You will probably, do you guys see clients now? Anybody see clients now? Ever seen clients? Want to see clients in the future? No, who doesn't want to see clients in the future? Vote for that. A lot of folks are on anti-epileptics, right? Why is that? Well, because a lot of people have seizure disorders, and anti-epileptics are used for a whole lot of other things too, right? So it's not just for seizure disorders. A big one is like topiramate, right? Anybody heard of topiramate? It's an anti-epileptic. They also use it for migraines, right? So they use it for other things as well. They work by, like, shutting down, closing your sodium channels, which is great. If you're having a seizure, what's the number one thing you want to do? Like, stop the seizure, right? So if you want to stop those action potentials, that's pretty awesome. Hey, who loves Japanese pufferfish? I just always like to ask. Tetrodotoxin, that actually blocks sodium channels as well. So that's why you have to watch, like, that's what will kill you if you eat the pufferfish the wrong way, right? You didn't know this?
No. I don't
Have
need a
you
lot
never
of
seen
comfort.
Charlie's Angels?
No. No. It's on there. I think.
I feel so much better that you're learning so much pharmacology from Charlie's Angels. I'm going to say I didn't see that movie. But pufferfish, it's actually a delicacy, right? You have to, like, train for a really long time to know how to cut up the pufferfish so you don't kill people. Because, Olivia, what's important for a restaurant? Repeat business, right? And if you kill all of your patrons, it's not going to help you because you still have bills to pay. So, if you're thinking about, you know, opening your own pufferfish restaurant.
Top on the list, right?
It is, right? You have those moments, like, I understand, like, when you get, and I think it's probably, you're all, like, third years for the most part, right? Like, that's the part where, that's the trough, right? Of the trough, the bottom point,
You know,
Like,
you're
like
going
we're
with
eating.
It's the trough of your graduate school experience. Is like that midpoint, right? Like that third year, right? When you come in early, you're like so excited, right? And then you're like, man, this is awesome. But then you get sort of bogged down in the middle, and then you start having those. And I know, like half of you have had these weird ideas, like, man, I could quit now, and
a rap guide.
yes.
And have a puffer fish.
Right, and it's some crazy idea, right? Raise your hand if you've had that. Like, yes, I know, right? Like, everybody has, right? It's normal. I promise you. You have this moment where you're like, you know, I'm really great at juggling bowling pins. Like, I bet I could make money on YouTube doing that. It happens. It happens. And there's somebody you know who did it, right? There's like some mythical graduate student you've heard of who quit and became a whitewater rafting guide, right? And is so much happier. But that's not you, right? Yeah, they're probably just like throwing puffer fish at rival raft guides, like deflating their rafts. I don't know. Killing them, yeah. So anyway, Japanese puffer fish. Oh, I guess I should have finished like that kernel I was giving you there. It was hang in there. Because if you're at the trough, it doesn't get any worse, right? When you're all the way in the bottom, it's just got to get better. Now you can be down there for a long time.
You're going to be there.
But you'll come back up. I mean,
Give some of that ketamine.
eventually. Yeah, I know,
All the
right?
time.
Hey, if it gets that bad, just go eat a puffer fish whole. It's going to block your sodium channels. This is actually, TTX is actually used in experiments a lot. So you can go buy like little vials of TTX. I know this. The lab I was in graduate school, we had some. We had to have Homeland Security come check us out. Because you could actually weaponize TTX, right? You could think about this, right? So you could like weaponize this stuff, right? We had so much of this. It was like in a literally this big. That's how much TTX we had. And it was so ridiculous. Like I could have eaten the whole thing and wouldn't have known. Like that's how, because we were just like shutting down one cell at a time. Like that's how much TTX we had. We could shut down like 10 cells. And the Homeland Security still got to go like, you got that thing locked up. So we had to lock it inside our, because you have to keep it refrigerated. We had to lock it, we had it in a lockbox chained to the inside of our refrigerator. Seriously, I'm not exaggerating. It was ridiculous. All right, there's stuff that you already know. You already know this. Cranial nerves, whatever. Hey, fight or flight. You guys know the sympathetic nervous system, right? That's something. Does that ever get turned on? Never. Right? Probably December 12th. I feel like you're sympathetic. That's the final exam for this class. I feel like that might do something. So this is important. How many of you know about like drugs that folks take that affect like norepinephrine or acetylcholine levels, right? So like SNRIs, for example, right? So it's a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Folks will take those, right, for depression, yeah, tension problems. Sometimes they'll give you an SNRI. That's awesome, right? It's like going to fix that problem. But because we're thinking about like fixing a central problem, sometimes we'll screw around with a peripheral problem. So when you give these folks these drugs, they'll have side effects, right? So this is where we talked about therapeutic versus side effects, right? And some of that's going to be central, and then peripheral is going to be your side effects, okay? So you got to keep that in mind. I don't know, that's like a developing brain. Here's the story on this. Don't screw around with this process. Do everything you possibly can and advise your clients to do everything they possibly can to make sure this goes smoothly, right? Because when it doesn't, and you get out here beyond, like, I don't know how many days you have one of those things inside you, whatever day that is, that's dangerous, because you don't know. if you screwed around with the stuff here. And it keeps developing, like, even once you're born, right? So, like, probably, I mean, like, well into adulthood, like what we think of as adulthood, right? Your brain is still, thankfully, undergoing some maturational processes, right? So things can still get better. I mean, not for any of you. You're probably past that point. But, you know, there you go. But thanks to Heb, we know you can keep learning. Oh, Heb. Yeah. I'm just thinking about what we should do for a St. Patty's Day departmental party. We should have like an OHEB party. That would be exciting. I don't know. There's your brain. There's like blue stuff. Here's the problem. So this is like, I don't know. This whole like Diencephalon, I don't know. I think that's a real waste of time too. The reason I do is because it's like, so they've got a problem in their Diencephalon. Well, what in the world does that tell you? I don't know. I mean, it doesn't tell you anything important, right? Even if somebody says, well, their thalamus doesn't work right. That's like saying, man, your car's broke down. It's like, okay. You know, if you went to your mechanic and he said, man, there's something wrong with your engine, Jason. No shit, that's why I came in. Telling someone they've got a problem in their thalamus, it's like, whatever. You've got to really think about like what part of your thalamus, right? Is it like a whole circuit in your thalamus? Is it cells, right? Is it what is it, right? And so I don't think this thing really gives you much help. There are people who will beat this into you, Cassie. I don't know if someone has. So this is where I come on the other side of it. Like, that's a waste of time. So I came at the world from a different perspective than most people. I think there are a lot of like people who are, I don't know, I'm like right on the cusp of folks who are like, yeah, that whole like classification thing's not important, right? So if you were to actually go back and get like a biology degree, a lot of times they'll make you study all this like taxonomy stuff, which is like a complete waste of time as well, right? Because it's like, who cares what some guy 200 years ago thought about these two beetles, if they're really related or not? Because we're constantly finding out things that they're not related, right? Because it's like, well, DNA says, well, these two beetles, they didn't even come from the same place. They both had green wings, and some guy's like, green-winged beetles, they go together. And it doesn't really matter, right? And I think for the brain, it's sort of the same thing. It's nice sometimes when you think about, oh, okay, so you've got, you know, this sort of area of your brain is important for, you know, your pons. It's like, well, that's important for whatever. You know, your brain stem, it does like your kind of life functions. I call it the idiot box. Right, it's the things down there that if you had to be responsible for them, you would die, right? Like blood pressure, breathing, heart rate, those things. But even that's got other subdivisions. So all of this up here, it's like blue stuff. It's like, whoa, man, that's cortex. Okay, fine, whatever. But they're like different parts of cortex, right? And different within cortex, there are different kinds of cells that can be affected, right? So there are different cell types. We talked about that kind of at the beginning of class. What I do think is good about this, though, Jason, there's like one good thing about this, is it made so much of it blue, right? And so this is what we talked about. We talked about sort of the line between Parkinson's and schizophrenia, right? When you take a drug to increase a neurotransmitter level because this little piece of your brain right here doesn't have enough acetylcholine, well, guess what? Everywhere else gets too much acetylcholine, right? And so it's a system-wide issue. We're not yet, although we're getting there. We talked about that briefly, getting where we can target these independent areas, right? So I think that's an important thing to think about. Growth factors, you should have these. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Try to make your brain grow as much as you can. If you're responsible for someone else's brain growth, put some effort into that. There's a spinal cord. Did we talk about the area postrema and vomiting?
We talked about projectile vomiting.
Yeah, that's it.
I don't remember why.
Yeah, you don't remember why. Thanks for being honest. The reason for projectile vomiting is that's a weak spot in the blood-brain barrier, right? And so we can like measure if there are toxins in your blood. And then one way toxins may get in your blood is because you ate something, right? And so then you just vomit that. And you want to vomit it. You don't just want to have a little dribble. You really want to get rid of that. And you want to get rid of it as far away from you as you can, right? So that's why you're just going to shoot that out. This reminds me of my brother.
So funny.
I'm sorry, what?
It was so nice.
Yeah. So he's like 10 or 11 years younger than I am. And he had like a lot of digestive problems, so he had to have this like special like baby formula that some baby had already eaten halfway, and then they would like dehydrate it and you would reconstitute it, right? Because he couldn't, I don't know, he's like lactose intolerant plus like other things, and he would constantly just vomit, like projectile vomiting all the time. It was awful.
Sounds horrible.
It was. It was. No one wanted to sit by him. I mean, because it was just like you knew it was going to happen. You just like wear a poncho. I don't guess he does that anymore. I don't ride too many places with him.
That's really sad. Maybe you should ask him.
He seems fine. I just saw him today. He seems fine. He's moving around. Looked healthy. Had good color in his cheeks. I don't know. He's fine. He's losing his hair faster than I am. I'm excited about that. Right? I mean, it's going to happen to like all of you, right? Like at some point, you're going to lose your hair, even if it's like after you're dead, because it's going to fall out, right? I mean, it's just that it disintegrates. But it's nice when someone like a decade younger than you is losing it faster, right? So he's like hairline's back here now. It's like, great. His is still dark though. That's a little disappointing. You don't need to know about those. See, again, Metencephalon, whatever. Dorsal raphe. Hey, make sure you put like median or dorsal raphe nuclei if you're going to search that on the internet, or you'll get something you don't want to see. Don't believe me? Get off the MU internet and just type in raphe and see what happens. I know, like half of you are going to do it, and you're going to come back and you're going to say, I should have listened. We'll talk about these brain regions as it's important to us. Hey, the VTA is really important. This is the guy that's really responsible for drug addiction, right? Your ventral tegmental area and that connection to the nucleus accumbens, right? We'll talk about that later because we're going to spend some time talking about, because I think some of you are going to see clients who are addicted to drugs, right? Is that going to happen? Maybe. Yeah, so you got to think about that. It's also the brain region that gets worked up for the like maternal instinct. That's something to think about. Jason, I always tell people, your mother doesn't love you. She's just addicted to taking care of you. Which probably explains a lot of people's mothers' behavior, right? When you start to think about it, you're like, wow, right? It's so eye-opening at that point. Thalamus, hypothalamus. Hey, pituitary gland. This guy's important. It's important because this, like, if I was going to say, like, what's the most important, like, when you're thinking about the part of your brain that has the biggest influence on your life and your development and your, like, personhood, it's probably the pituitary gland. Because that's the guy that tells the rest of your body to shoot out hormones, right? And hormones drive so much of what's going on, right? So that hypothalamus is going to tell the pituitary gland. It's kind of weird because it's like it releases a hormone that tells a hormone to be released that releases another hormone. It's like a 3-step process, but that's okay. Eventually you're going to release a hormone from somewhere, and that really drives like so much of the development of you, right? And those life stages. So I think that's kind of a cool thing. I don't know that a lot of people would tell you the pituitary gland is like the most important part of your brain, but I think it is. I mean, it's up there. It's not my favorite part. Like, it's not like the most thrilling part, but it's important. And again, there's the word hormones, just in case you missed that. HPA axis, we'll talk about this when we talk about like stress, right? That guy gets worked up. You got your adrenal gland. That's the elf hat that's on your kidney, right? That's why the word renal is right in there. Adrenal, right? It's like adjacent to your kidneys. Adrenal gland. That's why we call it adrenaline, because it's coming out of the adrenal gland. Nobody ever says, like, you know, they have like an adrenaline rush. Nobody says I'm having a kidney rush, which I I think about that sometimes, right? Like if somebody says, I've got a kidney rush, you're thinking something else. You're like, it's across the hall, through the orange door. I don't know, are they both orange?
No.
Are any of them orange?
What, I think the girls is tan, right?
One of them.
I don't know that it's important.
Pretty sure they're tan.
Hey, on the break, go take a look. At 6:20.
Oh my god.
Oh, the limbic system. That's important. Why is that important? Something about emotional responses goes on there, right? I don't know if you guys are ever going to deal with someone who's like got a problem with emotional responses. It's also going to deal with like motivated behavior and learning. So that's something as well. The basal ganglia, these guys are important. There's some debate, like somebody will tell you like, hey, what's in the basal ganglia? And they'll list like 3 things. Some other guy will say like 4 things. And then somebody will tell you it's like 2.5 things, but whatever, it's the basal ganglia, right? Jason, I don't want you to get worked up about what's in there, right? The striatum's in there. That includes like the, you got your caudate, you got your putamen, you've got your globus pallidus, you got a few other things, right? But those are the big guys. Some people will tell you the subthalamic nucleus is in there. I don't really care, right, one way or the other on that. I'm ambivalent about the subthalamic nucleus. The basal ganglia are important. Motor control, so if you think about like Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, it's also highly implicated in other sort of disorders, other things for which you might see clients. Anything that has stereotyped behavior, right? So think about some of the things where someone will come in and they have sort of uncontrolled stereotyped behavior. You guys know of any of those?
Autism.
Autism is a great one. I think about my old neighbor Jim. When I was in graduate school, we had this guy, he lived with his parents. Jim was probably 25 years old. He would talk to you all the time, but he rocked back and forth the whole time he would talk, right? And then he would steal your electronics that you were trying to throw away and make like, solar-powered Christmas lights. He would constantly, like, he would just walk the neighborhood because they didn't let him drive. He would walk the neighborhood and he would take, like if you were throwing away electronics, he would take all that. And his garage was just like banks and banks of like electronics equipment. And he would just like constantly make things for people, which was exciting. But he had this stereotyped behavior. Tourette's, that's another one, right? It's kind of like facial tics, other tics, right? So it's going to be that uncontrolled stereotyped behavior. If you think about, what about OCD, right? That's an uncontrolled stereotype behavior, right? If it's hand washing, you're going to constantly be washing. It's the same thing, right? It's a ritualized, kind of behavior. That's all going to be funneling through the basal ganglia, right? So these guys are, we've sort of classically thought about them just in terms of Parkinson's disease, but they, or Huntington's disease, but they play a big role in other disorders as well, which is kind of interesting, right? I don't know if there are a lot of folks like focusing on that as much as they should. It's kind of a newer way to think about the world. See, that's exciting, right? You didn't know, like, so now you're dealing with an autistic patient. You got somebody with Tourette's. You got somebody with OCD. You got to find that common link, right? And that common link is going to be the basal ganglia. So you just treat them all the same. Just get in there and like wiggle around their basal ganglia and see what happens. The amygdala is important. That's an important brain region for fear responses. If you see anybody with like PTSD, if you see anybody who doesn't have an amygdala, that's going to be exciting. Yeah, those people will be strange. Because they will just, I mean, you think about somebody who doesn't have an amygdala, they're like, oh man, I bet they're like jumping off the top of buildings. Well, maybe, but they might just be doing other things too, right? Because they don't really think about or have any concern about the consequences of their actions. So jumping off of a building is fine, but like walking around and like insulting everyone you know is probably not, right? Because that's like hurting other people. You just jumping off a building is your business. I don't know. That's probably like a... So I had this like philosophical question for a moment, and I was thinking like, do you ever have this moment where you're Corey, maybe you do. where you're thinking, should I? What if someone like says to you, yeah, I think I want to commit suicide. Like, I mean, that's like your choice, right? I mean, do you ever have this like philosophical moment where you're like, I'm not really sure I should intervene with someone else's free will?
Yeah, April was saying that last month. She said no, I say yeah. I'm like, whatever, we're overpopulated.
That is true. That is very true.
But does that mean that you should help? The assisted suicide question.
No, I mean, I think if you're going to let somebody do it, just do it. I mean, I think at that point it's like, if you're not going to stop them, you're helping them, right? It's just like how motivated are you to help them, right? I mean, that's like, if there's somebody on the side of the road and they have a flat tire, you know, if you're going to stop, I mean, you might as well like help them change the tire, right? I mean, if you're just going to stop them, like ask you, are they okay? You just change the tire, right? I mean, at that point you're invested.
So what do we do with the suicidal? Like, how's that been? We're invested, so you might as well. We're gonna do something. Okay. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think he was talking about assisted suicide. That's,
Oh.
you know, I think you've already invested if you've just decided to let somebody commit suicide. I mean, if they need some assistance, I think that's...
So like morally, there's not a difference in your mind, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's in my mind. It may be different in your mind. There are different brain regions involved, right, in these moral decisions, right? Do you guys know that? That's kind of an exciting thing to think about. There's a wrinkly cortex. Corpus callosum, that's kind of interesting. Some of you may see folks who are acallosal, right? They don't have a corpus callosum. I think 1 in 600 kids are born without a corpus callosum. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So they'll do some weird things. They're not going to be as weird as someone who had their corpus callosum cut as an adult, right, or later in life. They don't do that as much as they used to. They'll do it when they need to for intractable epilepsy, right? They'll cut your corpus callosum so that the seizure doesn't spread from one side to the other. And then you can do some cool things with people, and like if they smell things, or like if you show them a sign to one eye that says, "Hey, eat a banana," and they'll like eat a banana, and you ask them why, and they'll go, "I must have been hungry," because you know the hemispheres aren't communicating. It's really exciting stuff. Cortex, that's not important. I mean, you've got all kinds of different. I mean, so here's like a rat brain down at the bottom, and there's like a human brain at the top. There's like a lot of stuff that's the same, right? There's a lot of stuff that's not the same. And this is where you have, you know, this kind of problem between, well, if I'm going to try out a drug, I'm going to try it in a rat first, because I don't, even though we are overpopulated, they're not like letting people sign up for just these like random, I'm going to like cut out part of your brain or give you drugs kind of things, right? So we're going to do it in rats first, but there are some important differences, and sometimes things when you try to go from one species to another doesn't work. Why that is, most people will tell you like, man, the human brain is awesome in its complexity or whatever, and it is, but a rat's brain is awesome in its complexity as well, right? I think what's really important to think about, and most people don't, is what is this brain supposed to do, right? Like, what does that brain do for a rat? And what does this brain do for a human? And they both help us survive. And which one of us is better at surviving, rats or humans? Yeah. I mean, it's actually it's a good question, right? And so I think sometimes when you're trying to do research, I think anytime you're doing something, you should really think about your model species, and you should understand its natural environment. This includes people, right? This is not the natural environment for people, right? Okay, this is not the environment in which we evolved as a species, right? And the things that we've created recently, like walls, and all the things that come with walls, may not be well suited to the brain that we evolved over time to deal with the problems that we were facing in our natural environment, right? And so I think, how many of you have seen clients with attention problems? Okay, attention problems are really problematic right now, right? Not to try to like make a circular definition there and use the same word twice. Some of you may have attention problems. Some of you may be medicated for attention problems. You don't have to tell me that. I don't really care, right? And it's going to be really difficult for you for like the 2 hours and 20 minutes you have to be. I'm going to remind you as much as possible. This class is 2 hours and 20 minutes. For that 2 hours and 20 minutes time, it might be really difficult for you to pay attention, right? If you have to sit down and you have to read a book and you have to read that book for hours and study, that can be difficult for someone who has attention problems, right? But be thankful you have those attention problems. Well, I guess it doesn't matter, right? Because if you didn't have them, you probably wouldn't exist and you'd never know. So if you think about, I think about that. So if you think about your ancestors, and I think about, this is why I try not to get too frustrated with you, because I know all of your ancestors had attention problems. And that was, I guess, good for you if you enjoy being here. Like, and not just here like in this class, but here in general. Like if you enjoy existing, right, you should be thankful. So if your ancestors at some point were sitting around a fire, which I imagine they did, because that's what all of our ancestors did at some point, and one of your ancestors was so contemplative, and they were just looking at, you know, the reds and the yellows and the occasional blues and the way the flames were licking the air and the swirl of ash, and the next thing you know, a hyena has eaten their face off. Because their buddy over there was like, hey man, what was that? What was that? Did you hear that noise? I heard something. I'm going to go see what it is. Just hold on. I heard something. Wait a minute. What was that noise? That guy lived, right? Because he was constantly vigilant. Okay. It's the same thing if you think about like PTSD, right? I mean, or some of these anxiety disorders. It's not an unnatural thing, right? I mean, it's you should be anxious. There are things that can kill you at any moment, right? You should be anxious sometimes. That's normal. Now, right? We think about like you're pathologically anxious. That's bad, right? But the fact that PTSD happens, that's a consequence of learning and memory and your limbic system. If you are driving in a vehicle and all of a sudden that vehicle explodes, you ought to be a little jumpy when you hear something go kaboom, right? I mean, that is perfectly reasonable. How many of you in the winter, how many of you wear coats? I think everybody wears a coat, right? In the winter, static electricity is really bad, right? Happens in my office. I think it's the wheels in my chair. I was like scooting around all the time. And so when I reach my doorknob, it's going to shock me, right? How many of you have a doorknob like that, like some point? And what do? You go, no, you kind of, because you know, like I've learned to be afraid of this, right? That's a normal thing, right? And so it's a normal process. So if I think about anxiety disorders, I think about PTSD, I think about all these other things. I think it's just a consequence of evolution and the way your brain works. So there you go. That was an interesting story, right? What was the point of that? Rat brains are awesome. They're not human brains, so things are going to be different, but sometimes they're similar enough, right? That's cool. Relative size, we could talk about all that stuff. I don't think it's going to do a lot for you. So that's chapter 2. Who enjoyed that?
The men's is on.
What?
The men's door is on.
Thank you. That's helpful. So I used to work in this building that was like had like 2 wings, right? Had a left wing and a right wing, and so it could fly. Somebody's an ornithologist. That's someone who studies birds.
I knew that. Thanks.
I knew you did. That's why I said it to you. No one else knew.
I have no idea what that was.
So in this building, sort of where our offices were, it was kind of down one side, so you kind of would just always go to the same restroom, right? So, but sometimes, you know, like one time those restrooms were closed or something, and then you have to go to the other side, right? But the other side, the location was flipped, right? So because it was an exact mirror image. So one of my colleagues, she went in the men's room on the other side, like not even thinking about it. I was just thinking about doors, right? Like, should I always just go in the orange door just to make sure I go in the right one? I don't know. But because I don't know, like on another floor, are the doors orange in the men's room and not? I don't know. And so I was just thinking, so she said she went in and she was like, oh, wait a minute, I don't know how to use that. And then she left because there were like urinals on the wall. So there you go. There's a story. I just think about that, right? And is orange even a good color for a men's room door? I don't think so. The reason I don't think so is because I'm thinking about guys who are like red-green colorblind, and men are much. I mean, men aren't like extremely likely to be colorblind, but they're much more likely to be colorblind than women, right? And so like I can imagine if the doors were just red and green, you'd get a lot of confusion because you couldn't tell the difference.
I have a sign though, right?
I don't know. I think about these, like I go to these, you go to a restaurant sometimes and they have like a, have you ever been somewhere and they have like a picture and you're like, I'm not sure if that's the right one for me because the picture is not really clear, because they try to get really cutesy, right? And they'll put a chicken head on, and you're like, is that a hen or a rooster?
Mermaids.
Mermaids, yeah. I was like, yeah, you gotta, don't confuse me, right? But if I ever own a place where there are going to be restrooms, there are going to be just like 10 individual restrooms. I'm not going to have, because I think everyone should have their own space when they do whatever they do in there, right? Whatever you're doing in there, you just need your own space for that.
So this is where you fall in the puffer fish?
Yes. And on every door, I'm just going to put a puffer fish. All right. We should spend some time talking about chemical signaling, neurotransmitters, and hormones. Because who loves neurons? Yeah, that's great. But they need to be able to communicate with each other. And when we take a psychotropic medication, it's going to affect that communication, right? And so we need to think about, like, how should that communication happen? There's some stuff we might talk about. We talked about the synapse. That's the point of communication between the neurons, right? So this is where it happens. Now, here's kind of a not true story, but sort of a true story, because there are things that go like in the other direction. It says transmission only occurs in one direction. That's true. Presynaptic cell to postsynaptic cell, that's where that neurotransmitter flow is, right? But that postsynaptic cell can provide some feedback to the presynaptic cell, right? And so it can do that. One of the big components that does this is nitric oxide, right? Nitric oxide is a small gas. It's a good signal. It's really involved in the learning and memory circuit, right? So there you go. Most of your synapses are going to be like on dendrites. This is kind of fun, right? Here's this nice, awesome dendrite with all those little spines coming off. Every one of those little guys can like catch a terminal from somebody else, right? So most of your neurons have like 10,000 different inputs. Some of them are as low as one input. That's like special cases in the visual system in your retina. Some of them have up to like 100,000 connections, and that's think about like Purkinje cells in your cerebellum. This is an electron micrograph. This is actually kind of nice. Sometimes they really don't pick the best electron micrographs to show you. They have like bubbles on them. I'm like, well, that's bad. This, I don't know what the magnification on this is actually. It doesn't say. It's probably 15 to 20,000 times magnification is where we are. This is a terminal coming down from another cell. These little guys are synaptic vesicles. I wish my marker would work. I think I can get a laser pointer somewhere. This is frustrating. All the same. These little circles, those are your synaptic vesicles. They're going to be full of neurotransmitters, and they're going to release those into this. This is actually space right here, right? And that's a thin line of space right there. That's called the synaptic cleft. A little bit of a gap. They're going to release that neurotransmitter into that gap. And then, who remembers that ligand-gated receptor we talked about like 20 minutes ago? Okay, that guy is going to open and close, right? Based on that neurotransmitter that's going through. Here, for those of you who are interested, is the mitochondria. You can even see the little stacks in there. So that tells you like the magnification that we have. 20 nanometers, right? Man, that's really small. I don't know if you guys measure things in nanometers or not. Probably not on a regular basis. A nanometer is a lot smaller than a millimeter. Not as small as a picometer. That doesn't tell you anything, does it? No, it's super thin. I know it doesn't. So anyway, it's super thin. That's exciting. Don't need to know about this. That's okay. Different places where you can have your synapses. That's not going to make a real difference to your life, right? It might at some point, but not right now. Presynaptic inhibition, don't worry about that. Oh, here's a fancy word you might hear, neuromuscular junction, right? For some reason they decided to like give a fancy name to the gap between your, in case you didn't know, your nervous system and your muscular system, right? So that's that neuromuscular junction. It's a synapse, same as any other synapse. It's got a presynaptic membrane, it's got a postsynaptic membrane. You're going to dump out some neurotransmitter, it's going to open ion channels. There's some other weird stuff that happens afterwards, so your muscles will contract. It involves some calcium and some other things. Not going to be important to you. There are, and you're going to have to know all 100 neurotransmitter chemicals for this. No. Just relax.
You're really anxious.
Yeah. You will need to know a few. We'll talk about these, right? The important ones. We'll talk a little bit about amino acids. Monoamines. How many of you have heard of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, right? If you've not taken one, you've at least taken a medication that you shouldn't have taken while you were on that MAOI, because that's basically every medication, right? And we'll talk about why that is when we get to monoamines and their oxidase inhibitors, which is kind of exciting. Acetylcholine is a big one. You'll need to know about acetylcholine. This is responsible for like cortical vigilance, right? How many of you want your cortex to be vigilant? I do, because that makes me feel like I've done something, right? Like if you're actually like paying attention and awake. Also, acetylcholine is responsible for muscle contractions. So if you were to take, if somebody were to give you like a big shot of an acetylcholine agonist, right? In your peripheral nervous system, you could just have all kinds of fun movements. If you don't break down acetylcholine, so this is exciting. How many of you have ever like flexed your muscle? You're gonna like impress somebody. You can imagine you get like a client's giving you some problems. Like, just launch you out. I'm gonna beat that depression out of you. I don't think does it work that way. Sometimes. The great thing about acetylcholine esterase is it breaks down acetylcholine. So if you were to make a muscular contraction, if you didn't have acetylcholine esterase, you'd be stuck there, which is bad. So you'd be just like rigid and frozen together. That'll be.
I have a question. So what you just said, all that, is that part of like schizophrenia, like the waxy flexibility? I forget what the correct term, like where they just get stuck and you can like move their arm, but then it's stuck like that until you move it again.
Catatonic immobility.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about how much acetylcholine's involved. I mean, acetylcholine has to be involved in it somewhere because it's involving muscle contractions and movements. It's interesting.
Isn't dopamine involved in movement too?
It is. Dopamine's involved. I would imagine dopamine's a much bigger player in that, simply because that's the main issue with schizophrenics. There are some other symptoms and things that might be going on. Yeah. But dopamine's going to be because if you think about folks with Parkinson's disease, I mean, it's a loss of dopaminergic neurons that's causing that problem. So dopamine's a big mover with movement. Just thinking about that. So yeah, that's a good question actually. You should write an essay about that. Like find a web box that's about schizophrenia and then relate it back. I'm expecting that. Other sort of big neurotransmitters, we'll talk about serotonin, right? That's an important one. We'll talk about maybe glutamate and GABA a little bit as well. There are lipids, neuropeptides, gases. We talked about nitric oxide already a little bit, right, as a gas. So we'll talk about a few of those things. So don't just think about, I mean, here's like a whole list of your neurotransmitters. I mean, this isn't everyone, but these are kind of the big ones. Adenosine is a big one. How many of you have ever been sleepy? Yeah, not right now, though. I can tell. Why does caffeine work? How many of you have ever taken caffeine to stay awake? How many of you are doing that right now? Yeah. Caffeine actually blocks adenosine receptors. Adenosine is like a byproduct sort of cellular activity. And if you think about that, like ATP, right, adenosine triphosphate is like the energy token of your cells, right? And so adenosine kind of makes sense that'd be a byproduct of that at some point, right? Using up that. So when you build up a bunch of adenosine, eventually you're going to, your adenosine receptors are going to go like, man, this guy's got a lot of adenosine. He's been up a while doing some business. We should probably put this guy to sleep. And so you're going to go to sleep. When you take caffeine, you block those adenosine receptors. And so it's like, well, there's no adenosine here. It doesn't matter how much you've built up. Now, at some point, though, caffeine will fail you, right? Because it's not as powerful as some other things you could take that could keep you awake, like methamphetamine. I don't know if that's a good idea.
Thinking not.
Yeah, I would stick with caffeine and LSD. Those are safe.
I'll let Dr. Pitt know.
I'm not going to provide it, because that's gonna be costly. Because I feel like I would have to give you some sort of like subsidized rate because you're graduate students. I feel like that would just be part of an obligation. What else? There's some neuropeptides that we might think about at some point, which are kind of exciting.
So would you say we should be familiar with this whole list, or not?
You will become familiar with the important parts of this list throughout the semester. So I wouldn't spend my days looking at this chart, right? This chart is just going to develop in your mind over time. Okay, because we're going to talk about the big groups of neurotransmitters. We're going to talk about drugs that affect these neurotransmitters, and so we're constantly going to be thinking about it. The important ones. Histamine's an important one too, right? That makes you sleepy. If you block histamine. How many of you have ever taken antihistamine, Benadryl, and you've fallen asleep, right? So when you have too much, you gotta dial it in just right. That can be dangerous. Let's see. How do we know if something's a neurotransmitter? I'm just going to tell you. I'm going to tell you if it's a neurotransmitter. You're not going to have to think about it. But if you did have to think about it, you have to think, one, it's coming from the presynaptic cell, right? So the presynaptic cell has the precursors to that, the pieces, to make it and some way to make it. Okay? So if it's acetylcholine, you've got acetate and you've got choline, and then you've got an enzyme that's going to put that together to make acetylcholine, and you do that in the presynaptic cell. You've got to have some way to inactivate that. Remember that time I told you about acetylcholine esterase? That guy breaks up acetylcholine to acetate and choline. So then you have some mechanism to inactivate it. There's another way we can inactivate things too. It's called reuptake, right? So when we talked about those SNRIs and the SSRIs, when you dump out serotonin, instead of breaking down serotonin, you just reach out and grab it and pull it back because you're going to reuse it. Okay? If you block that reuptake, serotonin's available for a longer period of time, and you're less irritable. You're more sleepy, but you're less irritable. Let's see. When you stimulate that neuron, you're going to release that chemical. That's another way you know it's a neurotransmitter. That's pretty straightforward, right? You got to be able to make it. You got to be able to break it down. And when that cell gets excited, it's got to release it. That's a neurotransmitter. I think here's kind of what's more important, because we're going to think about the functional side of that, right? It's actually got to do something, right? So you need to have a receptor for it on the postsynaptic cell. Okay? Anybody know why marijuana works? You have endogenous cannabinoid receptors, right? If you didn't have those, marijuana wouldn't do anything for you, right? Why does heroin work? You've got opioid receptors, right? If you didn't have an opioid receptor, guess what heroin would do for you? Absolutely nothing. It might turn your urine a funny color because you're going to well, I don't need that, and dump it out through your kidneys. But that's going to be it, right, Cassie? It's just not going to do any good. And so you have to have a receptor for something to be a neurotransmitter. We're talking about exogenous drugs there in those cases, but the endogenous drugs, if you think about your endogenous opioids, right, you've got a mu opioid receptor. If you think about dopamine, you got dopamine receptors, right?
Why do you have a cannabinoid receptor? Because like the opiate, that kind of makes sense. Like, you know, if you're having that's actually a really pretty interesting question. Anybody have any ideas?
Isn't that hunger?
Yeah. So most of you may not think about medical marijuana. In the I've got a disorder that I need marijuana to help me get through. You may think about medical marijuana in some other mindset, right? Like maybe that will make other kinds of marijuana available to me, right? And that's fine, whatever. But medical marijuana, they will prescribe it to individuals who have wasting disease, right? Like anything that you're going to have massive weight loss. Using marijuana is going to be a great solution to that. Okay? Yeah, munchies, that's good.
Are there people who are born without certain types of receptors, like where things just don't?
Yeah, that's possible.
Probably not very.
If somebody's born without dopamine receptors, that's not going to work. Right? It's not, right? Because you need dopamine for if you don't have dopamine receptors, you're not going to, we've already talked about Parkinson's disease, you're not going to be moving. If you don't have acetylcholine receptors, you're a goner, right? Because you have to have acetylcholine for these things. There are folks who have, so that's going to be like a non-viable mutation, right? If for some reason you had a mutation like that. Now there are folks who have, maybe higher or lower sort of availability of receptors and different types of there are receptor subtypes, that may or may not be as prevalent in certain individuals. This is one reason medications, psychotropic medications have different effects, right? Some folks may have, if you think about serotonin receptors, there are different kinds of serotonin receptors. Somebody may have a slightly different mix, and if the medication you're giving works on one type of serotonin receptor but not another type, it may or may not have as big of an effect on someone because they have these different subtypes. So I wouldn't think of someone not having right? But there's a good way to test that, right? If you want to go wonder if this guy has cannabinoid receptors, well, just make them smoke marijuana and see what happens. Huh?
It's an experiment.
Yeah, right? That's why no, I'm not going there. I almost did.
Do it.
Yeah, I was going to say that's why they call it experimenting with drugs, or you're just going to see which ones work. I'm going to try this marijuana thing, see if I have those receptors, because I don't know. Yep, guess I do. Let's try that ketamine thing, see if that works. Ketamine works in okay. I would. You just have to keep trying it. It's oh man, I don't remember. Just don't use ketamine and marijuana together because you're going to have some unexplained weight gain. And you're going, why do I keep gaining weight? I don't know. Because you're going to get hungry and you're not going to remember why. You guys don't think about this stuff, do you? You should. You should really think about this because it's I don't know. Agonist, antagonist, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about agonist and antagonist. Why is that? Guess what? Remember that little packet of ligands we were giving people? Those are agonists or antagonists. That's exactly what they are. Some of them are partial agonists, partial antagonists. Some of them are going to be mixed agonist, antagonists, right? Kind of depends on what you're trying to do. We'll talk about those. Those are really fancy. We'll talk about those in a moment. I think about that like taxes sometimes, right? Like an agonist antagonist or a partial antagonist. So it's I don't know, maybe you guys don't file your own taxes. But there's a certain point where if you got a pay raise, they would put you in a different tax bracket, right? And you'd pay more taxes and you may not actually get more money in your pocket. right? And so that's kind of like how, like a partial agonist would work. Like, we're not going to give you like a $10,000 pay raise because then we're going to be taking out so much more in taxes. You're not going to see it. Let's give you a $5,000 pay raise. You're going to pay the same taxes, but you're going to actually have a little extra money in your pocket, right? So we're not giving somebody Parkinson's, but we're also like alleviating their schizophrenia. That'd be like partial antagonist, but you can reverse that. You guys pay your own taxes? You guys file taxes? You pay somebody to file your taxes? Who does that? Really?
Yeah.
This is like this, I know, right? This is like the simplest tax you'll ever have. Like,
Oh, I always
I've
have.
got this W-2 and that's it, right? And then you're just like,
It's like cheap.
You can, it's America.
yeah,
I
you're
don't know how to do taxes.
Starbucks does it for free.
Yeah, but then I don't know. This lady Karen does it. She's done my parents for like 40 years. Okay, maybe not 40 years, for a long time. So she just does it.
all right, I guess Karen's trustworthy. All right, so we talked about agonist, antagonist. There are like things that are like direct agonist or direct antagonist. These guys are going to really work on that receptor, right? And at that binding site or some other site. Like on the receptor. They're going to like mimic that drug in some way. There are other agonists or antagonists that are not going to have that same effect. L-DOPA is one, right? So L-DOPA is a dopamine agonist, right? And so this is kind of a standard treatment for Parkinson's disease. It's a precursor. So we'll just give you more L-DOPA so you can make more dopamine, right? So we're not actually doing anything different. We're not actually affecting receptor function. We're affecting that precursor and that building function, right? So that's a little different. So some drugs will do that. This is awesome. Neurons can actually make several neurotransmitters, right? They don't just have to make one. And vesicles can actually be filled up with a bunch of different kinds of neurotransmitters, right? So that's pretty cool. So you got to be careful though, right? Like, oh, I'm going to stimulate this cell because it's going to release dopamine. Oh, but it also released, I don't know, something else, norepinephrine, right? Maybe you didn't want to jack up norepinephrine levels. I don't know. Maybe you did. It's up to you. Here's a synapse. You guys seen this thing before? Any questions about how this works? You sure? Or you just didn't want to hear me talk about it? I know this works. I wouldn't worry too much about this. Some things take longer than others, right? That's kind of depends on where we're going to mess with stuff. There are things called neuromodulators. These are a little different than neurotransmitters. They don't... They're probably not. I should say. They're probably not going to like open and close that ion channel directly, right? But they may do things that will enhance the action of that neurotransmitter, right? So they might increase the effectiveness, the length of the action. They might shorten the length of the action, right? So they can do all kinds of things.
What's an example of one of those?
Neuromodulators. So if you want to think about neuromodulators, I mean, usually you're going to think about things that are like peptides, right? So there are a number of peptides that will, these are like short little proteins that will bind and they can open and close receptors. GABA receptors seem to have a lot of neuromodulators, right? So there are multiple things that can bind to a GABA receptor, like GABA can bind there, obviously. There also alcohol and barbiturates, right, can bind to GABA receptors so they can modulate that activity. That's why I don't know if anybody tells you this, like don't mix barbiturates and alcohol because the barbiturates can modulate that activity. So that's a pretty good example.
It's like St. John's wort and SSRIs, how people like often take those together.
Yeah, that's a bad idea.
That is a bad idea.
That is a bad idea.
Just like a St. John's wort, like is that a neuromodulator of
Yeah, I think it's hard to classify things, but I would say that's probably more of a, I don't know. I have to look at the mechanism of action on St. John's wort. It does increase serotonin levels, and that's why you don't want to take it with an SSRI, because you can develop serotonin syndrome, which is not a good thing, and it can cause some serious problems. We'll talk about that when we get to serotonin. Jason's excited for that for some reason. Yeah, I mean, they should tell you not to take St. John's wort with SSRIs.
I think they do.
Okay.
It doesn't stop people.
It doesn't stop people. No, they tell you a lot of things, but you're right. A lot of folks do that, and that can cause some serious side effects. I just remember this one time I was at the Healthy Life Mart. There, is that what the name of it is? The Healthy Life Mart? Yeah. You guys ever go in there?
All the time.
Yeah. So they sell stuff there, right? And so I'm like, it's where? Up by Hobby Lobby? Yeah. Yeah. So I just learned that Joanne Fabric went out. Not that I was going to that Joanne Fabric often. But I learned it went out of business. And I don't shop at Hobby Lobby, so. But that's a whole separate story. So I was there at the store. So here's a St. John's wort story for you. So I was there. I don't know what I was buying, right? I was just like, probably buying whatever. And then the guy gets a phone call. And he's like, somebody calls in and apparently they're asking, should they take SSRIs and St. John's wort together? He's like, no, you shouldn't take it. He said, but you should really, I loved this line, you should really talk to your doctor about it because I'm just a guy who works at a health food store. And I was like, that's like the coolest disclaimer. I was like, yeah, you know what you're talking about, but you're also referring them to someone else who knows more about what they're talking about. So hopefully like 2 people will tell them don't do that.
I used to work at one. It was a trip. I got old ladies that would call me doctor. Like, I got people that came in like with cancer and were like, "What juice should I get for this?" I was like, "Whatever they're giving you at the hospital."
Right. Yeah. Man.
What's St. John's wort?
St. John's wort.
It's like an
It's a
herbal.
flower.
Yeah.
What's it for?
People will take it as like an over-the-counter antidepressant. I mean, I didn't really want to call it that, but it's what?
It's right there with the vitamin.
It is right there with the vitamins, and you can take it. I don't think like
Fuck it. Let's see what happens.
on its own it's gonna like cause you any problems, but when you do take it with something that's like actually a powerfully designed.
It interacts with birth control though, so
Yeah.
you'll be real depressed anyway.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's important. A lot of stuff works with interacts with birth control. Yeah, grapefruit juice will screw around with everything.
Yeah.
I love grapefruits, and so that's why I just like I don't care. I'll die, but I'm not taking medication because I'm just gonna eat grapefruits. I have my own grapefruit spoon. Like that's how serious I am about grapefruits. Which, by the way, is really just a knife. It's really just like a triangular serrated knife. They call it a spoon, but in no way, because it'll cut your thumb. Yeah. So St. John's wort. I don't know how effective it is. I guess it's effective because you shouldn't be taking it with an SSRI. So yeah, it does something. I don't know how effective it is as an antidepressant, though.
Connie's taking it.
Yeah.
Is it working?
No, then he went and got on an SSRI.
Did you tell him to stop the St. John's wort?
He just did it on his own.
Great. That's awesome. Some people do that. Questions of any other like stuff you see at the store that's like, I'll take this, give it a try. No, don't. There's like all kinds of stuff you can buy, right? Like I go into the store and I'm like, I didn't even know that was a vitamin. It's like, what is that?
People rub essential oils on their face to calm them down. That's like a thing.
Really?
Yeah, they like roll it on their temples before bed.
They have rollers, they have spray bottles, they
Makes
go
good
all
calm
out.
their skin.
Wow.
The more concerning thing is that Think about like the last time we were at the doctor, they don't ask you what over the counter stuff you're taking.
They don't always do that, right? And most people don't even think about it. Like I don't know. I mean, I know it's like largely a waste, but I do take a multivitamin, just because. I also take fish oil because I care about my heart, and because I would like to be able to run away from you. I take osteobiflex, so my joints will still work. I don't know. It's like sometimes I feel like an old person, like taking these pills. It's like I'm taking like a handful of Centrum Silver or something.
Why are this might be a dumb question, but why are multivitamins a waste? Because my doctor, when I had mono, told me that wasn't enough.
You pee it all out.
Yeah, I mean, do you need 1,500% of your vitamin C? Probably not, right? And so there's like cram a bunch of vitamin C in there. You need 100% of your necessary vitamin C for the day, right? Not 1,500%. You can't like take it like, well, that's my vitamin C for the next 2 weeks. It doesn't really work that way, right? Now, that being said, I mean, there are folks who have like vitamin deficiencies. Like often now I see to take like vitamin D or something, or there are other vitamins that you might need to take from time to time. I'm not saying don't take multivitamins. I mean they do have things in there that are helpful, but yeah, multivitamins are not like the cure-all of anything. I mean, it's all Orrin Hatch's fault, by the way.
Who's that?
These are the most uninformed bunch of people. He's a longtime senator from Utah, ran for president in probably 2000 in the Republican primary. You guys don't know Orrin Hatch?
We were 6. We were 6 years old.
So?
Is he like dead now? Jesus.
No, he's still a senator.
Well, don't come at me.
But there are only, do you know how many senators there are?
A lot.
99, because one just died. So there are 99 senators right now. That's not that many people you got to know.
Yes, it is.
And most of them don't do anything. But Orrin Hatch does. So why is Orrin Hatch important to you? And this whole conversation, which is not the conversation I wanted to have today, Jason. But finally, I got something intelligent out of this group, so we're going to go with it. Have you seen the documentary? It's by Chris Bell, not Prescription Thugs, because that's where you're going to go, because I haven't seen that one yet, so don't ruin it. The first one he made was Bigger, Stronger, Faster. It was the steroid documentary. Did you see that, Corey? It was a good documentary, wasn't it? And so do you remember when he hired the guys from Home Depot to make the pills at his house? It was like it is. So he's this. It's this whole documentary about steroids, which is really kind of fascinating, right? And I think he does a decent job presenting both sides of the issue, without really. I mean, there's like that really kind of awkward moment where I think he wanted to tell that one kid's dad, like, probably wasn't the steroids that caused your son to kill himself. It was probably the antidepressant he was on at 15 years old. That was probably the bigger player, but you know, he just like, you don't want to tell a guy that who just lost his son like a couple of years ago, right? It's probably a rough thing to do. So that was kind of a down moment. But the FDA, you guys heard of the FDA? Yeah, that's the Food and Drug Administration. Well, I don't know at this point, Sierra. So the Food and Drug Administration, they're the ones who are supposed to like check stuff you put in your body, right? Except they don't have to check things that are called dietary supplements. Now, do you know the guy who is like really big about like, let's not check dietary supplements? Remember your buddy Orrin Hatch. Orrin Hatch is a senator from Utah. You know what they make a lot of in Utah? I mean, that's true, but that's not really important to this conversation.
Wasn't ready.
I mean, dietary supplements is what's important to this conversation. They make a lot of dietary supplements, right? And for you to get the FDA like excited, Carmen, about a dietary supplement, it's got to make you sick. And it's got to make you and like all your friends sick. And then the FDA's got to go, well, maybe we should look at this. You're like, oh yeah, they're putting arsenic in this. So we should probably pull it off the shelves. Otherwise, they're going to leave it there. That's when this guy, Chris Bell, pulls up to Home Depot and he hires migrant workers who normally do construction work to come to his house because he's going to make these supplement pills that he's going to then take to like a weightlifting show or conference or something. And he just like, I don't even know what he's packing in there. It's probably just like sugar and like a sprinkle of whatever he says is in there just to put enough in there so you know it's there. And, you know, it's like a proprietary blend, so you don't have to tell people what's in it, right? And you just say, like, here it is, and you can buy it, and you can just, like, pack this stuff at your home. So there you go.
Is that what they did with that, like, alcoholic energy drink? You know what I'm talking about?
Four Loko?
Yeah. Mm.
I remember
There's
that.
Another one.
But that's a bad idea.
Or something.
Drinking makes you tired.
But what's it in, like, microscopic levels of cocaine or something crazy?
Oh, I think that was Red Bull, right?
Really good.
I heard that. I don't know. That's... I mean, I think if you're drinking Red Bull, your standard of what you put in your body's pretty low. So. I mean, at that point, it's like whatever. This is my take on it, but you know. Yeah, I don't know what happened with that. I obviously don't drink Red Bull, so. What color is it?
Does anyone know?
Yeah.
It's like yellow.
Like, do you ever like pour it out?
Looks like
With the
Bud Light.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yellow.
I don't drink Bud Light either, so.
Okay.
Bud Light?
Either.
Is Red Bull like the color of ginger ale, I think. It's like apple juice. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's
like
like
beer
a
color.
Yeah.
All right. That's something. So, the whole point of that was dietary supplements not well regulated, right? You can just slap a label on it and sell it. And you can thank Orrin Hatch for that because it was his idea. Because Utah, those Mormons make a lot of money from dietary supplements. I don't know. Do you think... That's probably not a good joke. I shouldn't tell that one. But I was thinking about whether or not like St. John's wort helped you like hit the higher notes for the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I don't know. I was just like thinking about that. Like, what kind of dietary supplements do they take so they can sing well? You guys don't think about this stuff, do you?
No.
All right. Vesicles, exocytosis. We got to dump the vesicles. You don't really need to know how this happens, so we're going to skip it. Because I think you guys are going to get confused. That looks exciting, right? Do you know what this is? This is a vesicle. Look at that, right? And this guy, this is just like it's sliced open, and you can see like there's like glutamate inside, right? So that's pretty thrilling. This guy's going to like float down and dock at the end of that vesicle, and it's going to dump its contents out into the synaptic cleft. Hey, who loves botulism? No, a lot of people do. Yes, Botox. There you go, right? Ask Dennis Quaid. You guys seen him lately? Yeah, he really put, you know those like space saver bags where you like put the vacuum on it and it like sucks everything? I think he's got one of those ports back here. This last time, he was like, how did you get cheekbones like that? Like there should be flesh in there. And there's not now. The same thing happened to Mickey Rourke, right? You guys remember him? Yeah. That movie The Wrestler was pretty good. Did you see that one?
No, I'm thinking Haunting at the Megaplex. Wrong. Disney
Yes.
movie.
Yeah.
Oh.
It was Phantom at the Megaplex.
Phantom
Phantom at the Megaplex.
I gotta say, I didn't see that one.
You need to know who the FDA is? Jeez.
Yeah. See, I put important things in there. Orrin Hatch, FDA.
You've never even seen Charlie's Angels.
I think when I was a kid, I saw reruns of the Farrah Fawcett, Charlie's
Oh, this was
Angels.
the Cameron Diaz.
That's what I thought you were talking about. I assumed it was not.
No.
Hey, botulism's kind of something we should talk about, right? It is a bacterial toxin. It blocks transmitter release at the neuromuscular junctions. What transmitter is that neurotransmitter? Which one did I say was important for muscular contractions? Acetylcholine, yeah, ECH, right? So botulism causes that. It causes that to paralyze, right? So when you paralyze your face, apparently it sucks up. I don't know. They also use botulism for migraines. What?
Armpit sweat.
Oh, armpit sweat. Yeah, that's the other sort of vanity point too, right? So if you got a saggy face and sweaty pits, and your head hurts all the time, botulism might be the answer for you. Of course, in this particular class at this moment, you would never know. Like, I'm imagining most of you have sweaty armpits. I think most, right? 'Cause most of you are going to walk out like this because nobody's going to go like, hey, check them out. It's cooled down a little, hasn't it? Yeah. I don't think you need to know about this Clathrin-coded business because you guys aren't going to, it's not going to help you any. Kiss and run is kind of fun, but I would not recommend this for like you as an entire organism, but it's great for your synapses. What they'll do is like, you know, these vesicles, they just fuse for like a brief period of time, and then they kind of like make a little drop, and I think they call it a kiss and run. It's not a big deal. All kinds of different ways you can dump stuff. We did talk about those retrograde messengers, right? In particular, we talked about nitric oxide, right? That are released by the postsynaptic cell and then float back to the presynaptic cell to say, hey, you're doing some stuff. Just wanted to let you know. Great job. Autoreceptors, we should think about this a little bit. That's fun. So we're going to dump out neurotransmitter. How much of this are we going to dump out? How do we know how much to dump out? One, how fast is that neuron firing, right? That's related to the strength of the stimulation, whatever that is, right? Whatever sort of stimulus you're getting, whatever sort of signal you're getting, the more powerful that is, the higher that firing rate. That's going to increase release of neurotransmitter. That's straightforward, right? Don't worry about this exocytosis business. The other thing we have are things called autoreceptors. These are awesome. How many times have you done something and you wanted to know that you did it? Right? That's important. That's how many of you tried to send a delivery receipt with your last email? That's sort of an autoreceptor, right? So that you know, like, yeah, I sent that email and it made it. By the way, those are annoying. Just wanted to let you know.
How does it bother you?
Because I have to click an extra button. Because this.
Oh, I thought I wouldn't have done it if I would have known that there was something for you involved. I thought it was like a red receipt where it's like, oh,
even read receipts, I have to click that I read
I mean
it.
like in a text message. Thought it was
On your
like
iPhone.
Oh.
When you open it, it automatically does it.
Right. No, I have to do extra work.
Do that anymore. Well,
I'll tell you why those are annoying.
sometimes
Emails typically go through.
never.
And if they don't, you've got some record on your end of that. Right? You could always forward later, and I have to go like, yeah, I guess.
Watch next time it doesn't send.
It's probably not good. I probably didn't get your email.
That's probably right.
So what does an autoreceptor do? So you're dumping out a bunch of dopamine, right? And you're like, well, how much dopamine did I dump out? I don't know. A few vesicles worth, right? Well, I don't know how much it is. You've got this autoreceptor hanging on that presynaptic cell, right? It's a great place to put it. If that autoreceptor becomes stimulated, then we know there's at least enough dopamine for it to have sort of diffused its way over to me, right? And so if I'm getting stimulated, well, then all those other postsynaptic receptors should have been stimulated as well, right? And so a lot of agonists or antagonists can work on autoreceptors, right? If you block an autoreceptor, that's going to increase neurotransmitter release, right? Because the autoreceptor is going to go like, I'm not getting any signal. I didn't get my read receipt. Here's why they're annoying too. You will send me 3 more emails. Like, did you get my email? I just sent this email yesterday and you didn't reply. Did you get my email? You haven't yet, but you thought about it. How many of you have sent someone an email asking them if they received your email? Yes. I know, because one of those people complains to me about that sometimes. I'll let you figure out who it is. Huh?
Definitely go back to Mama Lions.
Yeah.
You need, yes.
She does. She does. That's true. She works great if you just take in a Post-it note with you and say, here's what I need, and you have her do it right then.
April hates it because she has a 24-hour policy, so if she
Yeah.
doesn't answer, it means she's pissed and you annoyed her, so don't email her.
Yeah. like to keep my inbox to 10 emails or less. That's how great I am at this. This has been a little rough these last 2 weeks, but
You delete them?
no, I have folders where I store them after I've dealt with them. I have like 200 folders, but yeah, but only 10 in my inbox. Okay, so autoreceptors. What if we stimulate an autoreceptor? And it's going to go like, man, I've released a bunch of dopamine, even if it's not really dopamine, right? It's like, well, stimulate that autoreceptor, we'll stop releasing dopamine, so we can do that.
Does that work on reuptake too? Or is that something else? Like, do they sense it and then they stop?
So you would have to block the reuptake.
Okay.
You'd have to inhibit that process, inhibit the reuptake. Seriously, it's like an arm that sticks out, and it's going to like shuffle back in the serotonin. So you've got to like block that process and that movement. That was a good question, though. It really was.
Is that a reuptake inhibitor? Or is that?
If you're inhibiting reuptake, yes. That is a reuptake inhibitor. So, yeah. And you can do that. Typically, we think about those. Not every neurotransmitter is this is actually a great question. Not every neurotransmitter is inactivated through reuptake. Some of them are enzymatic degradation, right? So acetylcholine, we don't usually talk about acetylcholine reuptake inhibition, right? We're talking about degradation or blocking acetylcholine esterase to block that degradation, right? If we're thinking about serotonin, then we're going to think about reuptake, because that's a different process. We don't usually think about serotonin breakdown. Does that work? Okay. I don't expect you to know which neurotransmitters are reuptake and which are enzymatic degradation. I do expect you to know when we talk about that, you know, what if we talk about an SSRI, I want you to obviously know serotonin must be inactivated through reuptake because you've got the reuptake inhibitor that you take. Norepinephrine's the same way. Serotonin, as we'll learn, and norepinephrine are really in the same family, right, of neurotransmitters, and so that's why they work through a similar process. And that's why sometimes you'll give somebody an SNRI for the same reason you might give them an SSRI, right? You might be giving them the same, to treat the same set of symptoms, right? Because they're very similar neurotransmitters, and they have some overlap in their functionality. We'll talk about that later. Don't try to eat all of that pie right now. There's reuptake. There you go. Cocaine is actually a reuptake inhibitor for dopamine, so that's something. Dopamine is an interesting one that actually works through. There are multiple ways you can affect dopamine levels, right? One of those is like monoamine oxidase inhibitors, right? The monoamine oxidase typically will break down monoamines. Dopamine is a monoamine, but they also have a dopamine transporter. If you think about what are the like 10 million things that dopamine can do for you, it makes a lot of sense that you have multiple controls on dopamine levels, right? Because it's so important. It's involved in, we talked about movement. It's involved in learning and memory. It's involved in this reward circuitry, right? And if that gets out of hand, if your dopamine levels get screwed up, you've got Parkinson's, you've got schizophrenia, you're addicted to a drug, right? And so you really want some tighter control on that. So that, because it's a more powerful system. So there you go. So cocaine will block that. Not a big deal. It does not, so this says like result may be excitatory or inhibitory. It doesn't matter if the neurotransmitter is excitatory or inhibitory when you're thinking about an agonist or an antagonist. What's important is did we increase the function of that neurotransmitter, right? So a GABA agonist will actually have an inhibitory effect, right? Because GABA opens chloride channels, right? So it's going to have an overall inhibitory effect. A glutamate antagonist that's also going to have an inhibitory effect, right? That wasn't the way I wanted to think about that. But that's okay, Jason. It's not all your fault.
I have a question. I'm trying to figure out how I'm trying to word it. So chloride channels, that's a negatively charged ion, right?
Right.
So are all inhibitory channels gated by a negatively charged ion?
So chloride is the only negatively charged ion that you've got on the outside of your cell that can move in any quantity. So any inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA and then glycine is kind of another one. They're going to open chloride channels. That's the only way to have an inhibitory effect on that particular neuron. Now, there are ways that you can inhibit an inhibitor, right? And so you could, that would be like removing inhibition, right? So if there's like a normal cell that's inhibitory and then you inhibit that cell, then the overall effect on that circuit's going to be positive, right? It's going to be excitatory. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't exactly sure what you were asking, but I thought that got it. But yeah, chloride is the only. Now on the positive side, we've got sodium, that's the main guy, but you also have calcium, right? So calcium is another excitatory. We don't use calcium a lot. We use it in special cases, learning and memory being one, and then in the muscular system as well, we think about calcium, which is a 2+, by the way. Hey Cassie, remember those receptor subtypes? They're important. They're like D1 and D2 receptors. It's really important when you start to think about opioid receptors, right? And we'll think about this. So there are like mu and kappa and delta subtypes, and they mediate different effects, right? And so some of those are, this is really fascinating. They recently developed an opioid analgesic, right? So a pain reliever that doesn't have an addiction profile, right? Like it's not addictive because it doesn't activate those other receptor subtypes that mediate some of those effects. It's pretty thrilling.
Not addicted like how oxy wasn't addictive or
No. This is like really not addictive. Not on the, see that, OxyContin was not addictive on the marketing side. This is not addictive on the biochemistry side. Right, so that's different, right? What the marketing folks tell you and what the biochemists tell you are sometimes two different things. The biochemists are saying, not addictive.
And that is
That is cool. It is very cool, right? It's very cool. We didn't talk about inotropic and metatropic, right? Inotropic receptors is going to be a direct kind of one-to-one. It's going to be a little faster. We're going to have an ion channel. Neurotransmitter is going to bind. It's just going to open up, right? The metabotropic, that's going to be a bit more slow. Not terribly slow, but because we're going to have to activate the G proteins, those second messenger system. Pellet's going to bind, and then it's going to send that second messenger off to open like 3 or 4 other channels right from the inside, ion channels, because it's not going to bind directly to an ion channel. Not a big deal. You guys know this stuff, right? You guys can know this stuff. You have the capacity to learn this stuff, so you're going to.
Well, you're acting like you don't.
I think sometimes you don't think you do. I don't, right?
Capacity?
Yes, I think you don't think you have the capacity to learn this. You don't know it. I know you don't know it. I know you don't know it. But sometimes I think you don't think you have the capacity to learn this, right? This is why I want you to read. Remember Oheb? This is why I want you to read that speech that he gave, because it's so important for, I think, you to reorient the way you think about psychology as a field and a discipline, right? Because it is a biological, right? I mean, you don't think about it sometimes, right? But you're looking at someone here who is like a monist in the like most monist sense, right? And so if you don't know what a monist is, I'm going to have to tell you, right? So there are folks who are dualists, right? And that's dualist with an A, not dualist with an E, right? That's a different kind of dualist. A dualist with an E is someone who will shoot you at 30 paces, right? A dualist with an A is someone who thinks like there's a physical body and then there's some like non-physical component to you, right? Whatever you call that, soul, spirit, whatever, right? So that's like over there, right? And that's fine, right? Whatever. That's your business. When you're not in this class, you can think that way all you want. It's not going to make a difference. When you're in this class, you should really adhere to monism, and I think it will help you in your practice to adhere to monism, right? Because monism says there is only matter and energy, and that's it. And whatever sort of other thing you think you have is just a manifestation of your nervous system, right? And when you think about that, then what are you left with? Simply a biological entity, right? And whatever that biological entity is doing, that's biology, right? I mean, that's just, you're really just studying animal behavior, right? That's really what it comes down to when you're trying to help someone through these problems, right? And I think that's what Hebb was trying to say in some sense when he was talking about psychology. I think some people forget you're dealing with a biological entity, and as soon as you forget you're dealing with a biological entity, the solutions you offer are going to be useless, right? Does that work? That's pretty awesome, right? So that's going to help you. That's why you have this class in reality, because you should think that way. Otherwise, you're going to go about it in a way that just doesn't work, right? If you don't think about why do people have attention problems, then how are you going to solve somebody's attention problem, right? I mean, if you don't think about what's actually going on at a biological level, looking at some other level, it just doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't really get you anywhere, right? So you have to be able to think at that other level. So.
Why did we move this to third year? I feel like we should have had this earlier.
Yeah, so I've taught it to first and second years the last time I really offered this. The problem there was most of you, not you, but even you, right? So during your first or second year, have you seen clients? So you're sort of thinking about why psychopharmacology is important you don't really have an appreciation for it. And so I think at that point you didn't really have any examples. When I say, hey, who's got a client who's been on benzodiazepines for 2 years? You're like, oh yeah. And you're like, well, that's a problem. I didn't know. And now you do, right? And so you don't have that sort of, so we've kind of moved it around a time or two. And so this is where it is now. Who knows where it'll be next when I offer it 2 years from now. So we'll see what happens. That's why the fourth years aren't in here, right? Most of the fourth years would be in this class because it would be third, fourth year, right? But I already taught it to those because they're somewhere else now, right? Because they were like first or second years when I taught it the first time. So there you go. This class also used to only be 1 credit hour. You're welcome.
It still is for me, I think.
Really?
Yeah.
We need to get that fixed because you need to get credit for three on this.
Yeah, that's why I was curious when I realized it was a 2.5 hour class.
Oh right, this is one that's like a seminar.
It is listed as a seminar.
It is.
We should get that fixed for you, Montana, because you should get
You can change the hours online.
you should get credit for 3 hours. I think
Not at this point, no.
Oh, yeah, it's too late now.
you can't get that changed. We'll just
He
kick.
can't do it himself.
We'll get we'll fix it for you.
Fix it.
Send me an email.
All right.
And because I'll forget. But send me an email and then we'll get that fixed. The rest of you, Keith probably told you sign up for 3 hours, or he didn't trust you to enroll yourself, and because he did that for a while, where they were like he was enrolling all of the PsyD students. I think it's Cassie, he didn't trust you. And,
I don't think it's funny. I mean,
and then I think he realized that was too much work, and so then he just went back to fixing the problems you create when you don't know how to enroll yourself in classes. So Montana, you didn't get that message that you were to make this a 3 credit hour class. If you want credit for 3 hours, which if you're going to be here for the whole class period, you should get that. I think anyway. Don't worry too much about this stuff. We'll talk about it when we need to. Protein kinases is going to just throw you over the edge. Because these are a bunch of words that you're not going to really think about them again. They're exciting, and you should think about this. And this is a lot of that stuff I was telling you, like the calcium calmodulin kinase, like the CAM kinase. That's involved in a lot of learning and memory processes. This is where calcium acts as that second messenger system, right? This is where you were talking about your NMDA receptors, where ketamine's going to inhibit this process, right? So we'll add this in where we need it. There's L-DOPA, right? We talked about that. 5-HT, that's an abbreviation for serotonin, by the way, in case you see that somewhere. Yeah, write that down, because I will use that. And you can use that, because that takes so much less time than writing serotonin. How many of you know how to spell serotonin? Yeah. So you can actually, that's a word you can misspell. 5-HT you cannot. Hey, this diagram is actually pretty important. And you might consider like printing this diagram and like putting it inside a sleep mask. You know, see what we're doing, right? This is a pretty important diagram. What's cool about this is this actually basically shows you where drugs can screw around with synaptic transmission, right? I think this is going to be helpful to you, right? When somebody says, oh, it's a reuptake inhibitor, and you want to think, like, oh man, let's have a little reminder about reuptake. Okay, what if it inhibits release or stimulates release or, you know, blocks storage in vesicles, right? So this kind of summarizes all the places where a drug could have an effect, right? And different drugs will have different effects, you know, in these places, right? So whether that's an illicit drug or a prescribed drug, right? They're still drugs and it's still gonna do things. So I think this is a pretty cool diagram. It doesn't really tell you what's going on, but you can see the you know, the plus sign or the minus sign. I think you guys can understand that. And they did the plus and the minus and the red and the green in case you were colorblind. You get both. Just in case. I went to high school with a girl who was colorblind. And at the time, I just thought it was weird because she said she always wore brown pants and made sure her shirts matched brown because she couldn't see the colors. Much later in my life, I realized how awesome that was. And I don't remember her name. And I was like, I wish I did, because females are rarely colorblind, right? You guys get 2 X chromosomes. And the genes that are screwed up for your receptors are on the X chromosome. So if you get one that's like, colorblind, just use the other one. Yeah, males don't get 2 X chromosomes, right? We swapped that one out for the Y. Lots of awesome stuff on there, like testicles and chest hair. And that's it. That's all you get on the Y chromosome, I promise. It's like the smallest chromosome of all, and it's just got 2 things. That's it. And then a bunch of, seriously, the rest of it's all like junk repeats, right? The rest of it is just a bunch of like non-coding junk repeats, which as a side story is how we figured out like Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had, you know, the fun they did. Probably fun for one, probably not for the other. Maybe it was, you don't really know what was going on. Because your Y chromosome, like if you have a Y chromosome, it's exactly, for our purposes, exactly identical to your father's, which is exactly identical to his father's. And so you could like find some ancient, you know, ancestor of Jason, and they would have the, if it's a male, it would have the exact, like if you go through the male line, you'd have the exact same Y chromosome. So that's pretty impressive, right?
What am I missing? What?
I don't know.
But what are you doing?
We were talking about color blindness, and we got off
No,
on.
after that.
Yeah, we got off onto something else. It was Thomas Jefferson.
The
They-
slave he had children with.
Sally Hemings. So they found a known male descendant of Sally Hemings and a known male descendant of Thomas Jefferson, and they both had the same Y chromosome. So at some point in their history, one of their like male ancestors was the same, and based on like all of the other evidence, it was probably Thomas Jefferson. Could have been Thomas Jefferson's father. And I'm not just saying that because they had the same Y chromosome. I'm saying that because his father also owned some of the Hemingses. I mean, that was a different story. But important for you to think about DNA and color blindness. All right, we could talk about this stuff later. These are like specific drugs. We'll talk about these drugs when they work on autoreceptors or they don't work on autoreceptors, whatever. So I want to kind of get through this quickly. Synaptic plasticity, that's the whole deal with OHEB. Synaptic pruning, that's kind of interesting, right? So you typically have more dendritic spines and synapses when you're like a child than you do as an adult, and you go through this like pruning process. It's easier to sort of throw in a bunch of stuff you're not going to use and then get rid of it, right, than it is to like try to rebuild that stuff and make those connections later. So you just keep the ones you use and get rid of the other ones. Don't worry about this. Hormones come from endocrine glands. You guys know this. They can have effects. Talked about the adrenal glands. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are coming out of there. Sometimes we will call that adrenaline and noradrenaline, right? I don't know if you guys have ever heard those words. They're just synonyms for epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's kind of interesting. See how it looks like an elf hat on your kidney? There are also glucocorticoids that come out. I mean, if you've heard of like cortisol or corticosterone, that's going to be in rats and mice, but we have cortisol. Cortisol is helpful, like sometimes. It's helpful in the short term. It's going to, like, you know, really get you going. It's going to liberate some things. You can have that fight or flight response. Long term, it's bad. It actually starts to kill your brain cells. So if you get stressed because you don't know something, then those cells may die in the hippocampus. And then, you know, they're like helping you, like, learning and memory. Then you get more stressed about the other things that you aren't able to learn. Right? It's just going to be like this positive feedback loop, which is bad. And you're just going to end up losing all your brain to stress. So you should try to stay stress-free.
But we're in the trough.
You're in the trough. You're in the trough. I mean, you don't have to be stressed about being in the trough. You're just there.
Okay.
Right? That's the way it goes. You guys know about hormones. Hey, what about the pancreas? That's something. I don't think any of this is really... Oh, I mean, melatonin's sort of important. I wouldn't recommend taking melatonin. There was this study with mice. And don't raise your hand if you take melatonin, because I'm going to tell you the rest of the story first and you'll decide what you want. There was this study where they were giving mice melatonin, and they noticed that it reduced the size of their gonads. That was kind of interesting.
If you're a lady, it wouldn't matter.
You still have gonads.
Oh,
That's what those are called. And they're important too, because they release hormones. And if you don't think they're important, I'm going to say probably ask your moms. Because I'm going to say someone's mom in here is close to menopause. Right? I'm trying to think about your age and your mom's age, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right?
We're hot mess right now.
Literally, right? Ask her if she still wants those ovaries to work. I'm like, yeah, because afterwards, you're not really getting hormones out of those things, right? You're just getting hormones other places, and it's not the same mix, right? So it's going to be a little different. Pituitary gland, we already said this guy's important, right? I think it's like this punching bag that hangs down. And here you go, like this is like all of the places where you can get hormones, and all of the hormones that we'll think about, in this class. Not all of these will we think about. I mean, I don't think it really matters if we talk about like insulin. We might talk about oxytocin, prolactin. That's kind of a weird one. Males have prolactin too. It helps with like smooth muscle contractions. Okay. Still have 5 minutes. Guess it's fine. Oxytocin is sort of an interesting one too, right? Oxytocin, it doesn't... Why they left this off? It's actually released right after you have sex as well. Which is why different kinds of voles are monogamous, right? Which is kind of a fun story. Or, very promiscuous. Gotta watch those voles. That's VOLES, right? It's like, it happens. You okay over there? Thinking about promiscuous voles? I don't know, right?
It's a bird.
It's a rodent.
Oh, I thought it was a bird.
You said that with so much confidence, too. It's like, it's a bird. No.
That changes the whole picture.
It does, doesn't it?
Oh my God.
Birds, by the way, those guys are, they always tell you like birds mate for life. They don't. Birds just keep mating throughout life. And we didn't really know this until DNA testing, which is kind of weird. And you can like test the chicks that are in the nest and find out like, that's not their father. Which is kind of weird.
Maury.
I think about this, yeah. I have like some Blue Jays on there or something. It's like, look, he looks like a cardinal. You guys don't think about that, right? I mean, obviously, cardinal. Well, I don't know. Maybe they could. I don't know. Hey, so why might you take melatonin? Folks might take that. This is a big one, right? Like, don't give kids melatonin, right?
Every kid I've ever seen.
I know, right?
Every
Yeah.
kid babysat, they gave them gummies. Oh yeah.
Please don't do that.
They're like, they're not sleeping 15 hours a day.
Yeah.
Dose. What does that do?
Yeah, what does it do?
Benadryl like the old days.
Yeah, I know, right? Whiskey. Just give them a shot of Jim Beam, right? I mean, that really puts them down. Melatonin is there are multiple neurotransmitters that work on your sleep system, and it is going to make you sleepy. But we just talked about sort of the negative effects of, especially if you're like trying to develop those things, right? And yeah, those gonads, which I talk about gonads in my physiological psychology class, and I use the slides from the publisher, and in parentheses it has rhymes with monads, and I don't know how, like they provided that information, and I just don't know how that's helpful, but I leave it on there because I think it's hilarious. There's also another typo in that class, which is kind of weird. It's talking about a fishing boat, and they replace the H with a T. Yes, which is a completely different kind of boat. Yes, it is. And I was like, wow, that's actually on there. I'm like trying to think about how many of you are like writing this. I mean, this is something, cocaine, nicotine, I mean, you guys know this kind of stuff, dopamine. Just trying to think of what's important. Okay. Yeah, you don't want too much prolactin, apparently. All right. I think you guys are good, right? So we've sort of almost caught up to where I thought we should have been.